Good morning. My name is Elaine Wilson. I am here today to discuss with you a very, very important artist who was born and raised and passed away in Lancaster, in the city. His name is Charles Demuth, and as we go through the program, I will be showing you examples of his work. I will talk to you about some of the interesting things that happened during his lifetime, and I also will discuss with you a little bit about how to understand better his compositions. They're not complicated, but sometimes it's good to know a little bit more than just what you're seeing, but also better to understand what his thinking was in the work that he did. He was born here, and this is the entrance into the garden behind his house, but this is the home that he was born and raised in. And the address is 118 and 120 East King Street. The property is still there. It's a museum, and when we're finished with the program and once everybody is let out to do whatever they used to do without being thankful just because they could do it, I suggest you go down there and take a look at his museum. It's very, very easy to get to, and it has wonderful examples of his work. This is also a little bit about his life that I think is important for you to know about ahead of time. He had illnesses during his life. A couple of them were crisis level, and this was one of them. When he was 7 years old, he developed a dry hip condition. Sometimes that happens with little boys. And when that happens, the hip joint does not get the fluid that it needs, and so consequently, his leg was shorter, and he limped all of his life. Now, he did carry a cane with him. People did see him going around Lancaster City without the cane. So we do think that there were times when he didn't need the cane, but when he traveled, it just was a nice extra little accessory that he added to his outfit. But because he was an invalid, an invalid in condition, he spent a lot of time in bed during that time. One of the things that his parents found that would be of interest to him was working with art, and he liked art. And he had a couple of aunts who were taking lessons in porcelain painting, and so they asked the instructor if perhaps their little nephew might come along. And so during the courses that he was taking in porcelain painting in Lancaster City, he developed an interest in flowers and natural vegetation, because that was the theme for many of the subjects that were used on the porcelain objects. He dies in 1935 at the age of 51, and I will get into what led to his death. He wasn't murdered or anything like that, but he did have some serious illnesses towards the end of his life. This is one of them. He was diagnosed with diabetes. He was 36. He lives to be 51. He will live for 15 years after he has been diagnosed with diabetes, because a new drug had just been opened up at that point in time, and it was called insulin. And I'll discuss that in a little more detail later. But at this point, let's just take a look at what's next door to the Demuth home. It's the tobacco shop. The tobacco shop on East King Street is now, unfortunately, it's closed. But the tobacco shop was the first tobacco shop in the United States. Perfect location because of all of the tobacco grown in Lancaster County. Aside from that, it also was owned and operated by the family of the Demuths until 2010. In 2010 it closed, and it seems to have been closed permanently since that time. But they still have the displays in the window, so you can still peek in at it. But it's the oldest tobacco shop in the United States. I don't know if they give you tours of it or not, but if they do, I would certainly suggest that you try one. Because it's exactly 2 doors down from the house. And just because I think it's interesting sometimes to know a little bit more about where you live, Lancaster is the oldest inland city in the United States. I didn't know if you knew that, but that is the case. Lancaster, this particular tobacco shop, was also the place where Benedict Arnold got his snuff, and it's also the place where James Buchanan bought his cigars. This is a self-portrait of Charles Demuth. He did this when he was 23 years old and he was studying art in Philadelphia. He will go to school down there and attend art classes there primarily to learn how to paint in oil. Watercolor will be the paint media that he will go to most frequently, but he is also an accomplished oil painter, was an accomplished oil painter. His father, he did this painting of him, or this watercolor sketch of him in 1907. And Demuth will be allowed to travel, and he will be out of the country when his father dies in 1912. He was 28 years old. He did a number of trips to Paris and some to London. He is an only child, and this is his mother. And one of Demuth's friends said, Augusta Demuth was a horse of a woman. She was 6 feet tall. She was a take-charge person. She was kind, she was gentle, she was generous, but she could do what she wanted to do, and she did. And she loved her son dearly, as did his father, and took very good care of him till the very last day of his life. And she will live to be 85, so she lives a lot longer than her son. I mentioned a minute ago that Demuth liked to travel. He went to New York City, he went to Provincetown, he went to Paris, he went to London, and he referred to Lancaster as the province. So when he wasn't in one of these places, he would say, well, you know, I must go back to the province. These are 2 of his watercolor studies that he did during one of his visits to New York City. He would go up there to hang out with different artist friends of his. And he also enjoyed the dining, and he enjoyed the jazz music, and he enjoyed sitting at the bar with his friends. So he really had an active, interesting social life when he was in New York City. And he would bring back here's another picture, another one. This is a dance hall where he would attend. He would bring back sketches of these scenes, and then he would work on them here in Lancaster. I want to call your attention to this right here. Do you see the 3 figures that are dancing, the sailors with the women? 2 of the sailors are more interested in looking at each other than they are paying attention to the woman that they're holding in their arms. Demuth was, without a doubt, he was a gay man. He did not flaunt that, but he was often able to sneak into some of his paintings interesting aspects about being gay, and here is just a little subtle example. If you didn't know he was gay, I'm not sure that you wouldn't think that maybe they were just a little bit upset with each other because they've jostled each other on the dance floor. That was not the case. In the painting on the far left, you can see that he is sitting there at a table, reaching over to get a drink from a tray. The bar or the restaurant that they were in at that time was in Harlem. It was called Marshall's. Marshall's was a black bar, and it had great jazz. You see examples of that here, and wonderful table areas where people could sit. He's gathered there with 3 of his artist friends, enjoying the evening and listening to the jazz. When he was in the province, he was not without cultural opportunities, because here there were vaudeville acts in Lancaster at the Colonial Theater. There were circus performances. And of course he started traveling abroad to Paris and to London at the age of 24, the year after he graduated from school in Philadelphia. And he went there off and on until 1921. He never worked at any job except watercolor painting and oil painting, because his father and mother were well off based on the income from the tobacco shop. So he didn't need that extra money that he would have made if he had had a job on his own. So he had the freedom to travel, and he had the freedom to enjoy what was going on around him. Here you have 2 acrobats and some of the equipment that they would use. Here you have an interesting man holding an acrobat above his head, and notice that they're going around a ring, because if you look in the corner, you can see the horse that he's on, and the horse will circle on around that ring. If you'll notice in this picture, there are a number of circular shapes. I'll make a point of talking about that in this next slide. 3 examples of how he loved New York City, how he enjoyed the province, and he loved the glamour, especially the glamour in New York City, and the noisy jazz clubs. They would have basement bars, they had hotel cafes, and they had fabulous art galleries, which was where he met so many of his artist friends. If you notice over here, you have acrobats. Here you have a vaudeville act. There's the stage behind the 2 women that are talking. And here you have a dance routine. As I mentioned, he painted most of his works in Lancaster in his studio. And he had an incredibly acute sense of composition. If you notice, I have drawn 3 green circles on this shape over here. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Those are compositional, that's a compositional technique, and that is designed to hold your eye as a viewer of the work inside the painting to make sure that you wander around enough to see it all. Okay, let's drop the circles off of the first one. And notice that I could have just put a plethora of circles here, because this makes the circle. There are other circles behind her. Notice how her legs swing, and here are the rings that she could have used to have swung out there. Here's equipment for a juggling act back in here. But the circular shape in this keeps your eye moving around inside the composition. Other artists do it as well. So this is not peculiar just to him, but it's an interesting FYI, and I just thought you might enjoy it if I used these 2 examples for you. This is interesting because you have below the spotlight hitting the floor and the spotlight coming on him, and then you have a suggestion of a circle in the background, but you'll also notice how the figure just tends to move. Notice something else. When he did this particular circle back here, several of the legs of the 4 dancers that are behind him as his backup extend beyond the circle, and that keeps it from being static, and it keeps it from looking like perhaps they're inside a circle and spinning around. They are not. They're sharing the spotlight with him. He visited Provincetown a lot. He loved Cape Cod, and he enjoyed Bermuda. He went to Bermuda with a man whose name you've already heard if you were watching my program that I did on Georgia O'Keeffe. There was one slide that showed another artist named Marston Hartley. Marston Hartley was a good friend of Demuth's, and they are the two that went to Bermuda for several weeks. And notice it was 1916 and into 1917. Those were the days when you didn't just fly off to some place for a week or two, you went for a while. And then you came back. And here's a picture of him sitting on the beach, painting. And there are a couple examples of his impressions of Bermuda. The next one is curious because it's very, very different, and this one would have been done back in Lancaster. These two could have been done in his room in Provincetown, or in Bermuda. But this one is of a church that is not too far from the seacoast in Provincetown. If you've been there, you might have seen it. And it fascinated him. And he did sketches of it and then brought those sketches home and did this oil painting of it. The oil painting is different in that if you notice the painting of the ships and then the painting of this, there are lines that break through the shapes. And they're a lot of fun. I've painted that way a lot myself. I enjoy it, not because I knew about Demuth when I started, but because it just seemed to be something my composition needs. But it does have an actual name. It's called precisionism. Take a look at what I'm talking about. There's a line he would have drawn, and he would have done the original sketch, and then he would have taken a straight edge like a ruler, and he would have established those lines on the canvas. And then you'll notice the fun part is this: where a building or another shape has a line coming through it, you can change the color. So you can do that, and you can also bring lines down and then angle them in other directions. You can make them dark, you can make them light, you can play with them. One of the fascinating parts about this for me is this tree shape, because he's established some of the foliage, and in other places he's left it open and airy. I mentioned intentionally Georgia O'Keeffe because Georgia O'Keeffe, who was the wife of Alfred Stieglitz, the famous photographer and the man that owned Gallery 291, where many, many artists wanted to show their work and also had an opportunity to schmooze with each other when there were receptions. Here's a picture of Georgia and Demuth. They were fast friends. In fact, Georgia O'Keeffe visited Lancaster, I don't know how many times, but when she would come, they would paint different scenes in her garden. And I mention pears because in 1924, he has started a series of posters, and the posters look like they are advertisements for the person that they are actually, for him, a portrait of. And you see here the G, and then her name is spelled O-K-E-E-F-F-E. And he has put that there. And notice the pears, and there is a pear that's been cut in half. That's a part of this painting for her. Here is an apple, here's a squash from his mother's garden, and here you have a snake plant. And the snake plant is important. I'll talk about the snake plant next week when I talk about Grant Wood, because he does a painting with his mother holding a snake plant in it. And the snake plant is a very strong, sturdy, determined plant. You can let them go for weeks on end and not water them. And then when you water them, they spring right back to life. And in the meantime, they just kind of incubate. And he saw Georgia O'Keeffe as the kind of woman who was determined, who was willing to work hard, to do things, to blast her way through adversarial conditions. She's a woman at a time in history when very few women are important artists. And for that reason, she has to be determined and she has to know her own thinking. And you learned about that when I discussed her recently. Take a look at these pictures. These are two that they would have done in the garden. There's George O'Keeffe's work. There's Demuth's work. And when I was researching her coming here, I thought, where would she have stayed? Well, right across the street from the tobacco shop and the home of the Demuths was the Weber Hotel. And this is an old photograph. You can tell that from this car shape down here. And she would have stayed in one of these 8 rooms that faces East King Street. And then I was able to find for you to look at this picture, and underneath it says Hotel Weber, East King Street, along Lincoln Highway. It's one of the well-appointed bedrooms. My goodness, it is. There's a sofa, stuffed chair, Beharback chair, door out, dresser, wonderful bed. It's really, it's early in our country's history, and she is staying at a fine hotel. They would gladly served her any meals she wanted. She chose to go across the street because the horse of a woman, Augusta Demuth, was an outstanding cook, and her fruits and vegetables were fresh from her garden. So therefore, she made the meals for Georgia O'Keeffe, planned them carefully for when she came to visit, and was more than happy to have her join their table. Augusta's garden will become a big source of information for Demuth as he works on flower paintings during his lifetime. I'll mention this again, that was the flowers that really fascinated people the most about his art talents. The very first slide I showed you an arrow coming down to an archway. This is the archway that you would have been standing in front of looking into the garden. And when you walk into the garden, this is the scene. The brickwork and all of the flowers that are around it are well tended by Augusta. If you look over a little, you'll see the house, and up here is the bedroom and also the small studio where Demuth did his painting. Here are 2 paintings that he did based on the flowers in the garden. And if you notice, these roses are here. There was a vegetable garden, but the vegetable garden was not in this center courtyard, was over to the side, and it's still there as well. So when you get there, make sure you walk around the garden. It's not large, but walk around it a little bit and take a look, because you'll get a feeling for the space that she operated in during her lifetime. Here are some of the paintings that Demuth did based upon what he collected from his mother's efforts. You have eggplant with tomatoes, you have grapes and turnips, and down below, peaches and eggplant with a green pepper. Now, there's an eggplant, and there's an eggplant. Notice something else. He does not repeat his compositions. He doesn't do the same painting twice. Each one is fresh and new and a different interpretation and statement of his work. You also notice something else about this piece. Each one of these has something from his mother's kitchen. There's a canning jar. There's a cup that some of the grapes are in. Here, he's taken a dish and put it behind these just to add a little more color. And down here, he took one of her compote dishes, turned it upside down, and then set the pear on top of it. So when you go to the Demuth Museum, if you do, make sure that you notice some of the comparisons and similarities between the paintings that he did, because they do have a wonderful collection there. A lot of people bought his flower paintings. As I said, he didn't need the money, but it certainly wasn't bad to have. So he sold a lot to collectors and to art dealers. Here's another example of how he changed a statement. There are tulips and there are tulips. Anytime you see the flowers or the vegetables, they have come from Augusta's garden. And the flowers changed, and then she intentionally would make sure that the garden was rich with color and with growth as many months out of the year as possible. Composition, I talked to you about circles just a little bit ago. I want you to look at these two. These two particular paintings are very different from this one. This is one that he did in 1921. I mentioned earlier he was diagnosed with diabetes in 1920, and in 1921 he has started to do again, or continue to do, more paintings. This one fills the compositional space. This painting floats. And if you look at this one, in order to push the iris shapes forward, he has added these dark areas behind, selective dark areas, not everywhere, just in certain places, just to help to give some drama and a better appreciation for what you're looking at when you see the painting. When he was in Philadelphia studying, he stayed in a rooming house, and another young man who was there at the time was a man named William Carlos Williams. He and William Carlos Williams will form a long, lifetime friendship. Although Demuth is gay, Williams is married. Williams and his wife will have 2 children, and he has studied art, but he was really very interested in poetry. But he was, as a profession, he was a pediatrician. And women loved to have him as their doctor to deliver their babies. And over a course of many years, he delivered 2,000 babies. Besides that, he liked to write poetry. His clients, his patients, had no idea that he was interested in poetry. That was his pastime. That was like just what else he did, and it took the pressure off what he did do, which in some cases was life-threatening for the women delivering the babies. I want to give you an example of his poetry. This one is called Wheelbarrow, and if you notice down here, I say that he used common topics and words. That was important to him. He didn't want 15-syllable words. He wanted short words, and he wanted to create images. So look at this, and then I'll read it along with you. And think about it. The red wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, beside the white chickens. Now, does that make sense? Well, not common sense, but you can certainly see all of the images. He became quite famous for his poetry over a course of years. Just as Demuth had done the portrait with the snake plant in it for Georgia O'Keeffe, he does this one for William Carlos Williams. And this one actually was a forerunner to pop art, which became much more popular and more frequently in public eye around the 50s and 60s. Andy Warhol, which I may speak to you about sometime, from Pittsburgh, was a very, very important pop artist. Anyway, William Carlos Williams is walking down a street in Manhattan one night, and it's raining. And this is what he sees and hears. And again, I'll read it, so when I read it, you can look at what I'm reading, or you can look at the portrait that Demuth did of him. He says, "Among the rain and lights, I saw the figure 5 in gold on a red fire truck, moving tents, unheeded, to gong clangs, siren howls, and wheels rumbling through the dark city. Demuth took this poem and did this painting. What's in it? Well, there are some of the lights. There's the name Bill for William Carlos Williams. There is his middle name, Carlos. There are his initials, WCW, down here. Back here in the distance, I remove these arrows, you can see some city buildings, just a suggestion of them. And yes, of course, Charles Demuth would sign his work as a gift to his friend, and there is CD down there. This painting became, and still is, quite famous, quite popular, and if you mention the name Demuth to people who are interested in art, you will find that a number of them will know the painting. I saw the number 5 in gold and know who did it. Another one of Charles Demuth's good friends, in fact, he became a very valuable friend to Charles Demuth, was a man named Albert Barnes. He and Charles Demuth would write back and forth to each other, even though Barnes lived in Marion, PA, which is part of the Philadelphia area. And Demuth was here and there. They would send each other postcards. The museum has some of these. And this one, Barnes has written, "Hurry back to Philadelphia, old man, for God's sakes, and art's sake, and have a beer." Nope. Charles met Albert Barnes in 1905. Mr. Barnes would become a very, very, very dedicated patron of Demuth's work, and he would own a number of pieces. And they would remain, Albert Barnes was kind of a touchy personality. He had his own way of wanting to do things. And one time Demuth wrote to his mother and said, "Don't worry, Mother, I won't upset Albert. I know how to work with him." And so he would be a good friend to Albert's and vice versa for many years. Now let's get to this picture. This is 1920. And Demuth has been diagnosed with diabetes. There are only a couple of clinics and institutes in the United States that offer treatment for people with diabetes, and one is one established by a man named Dr. Allen. Dr. Allen had bought a huge home in Morristown, Pennsylvania. It had been the mansion of a man who built a bigger house and moved to Long Island. Dr. Allen divided the property into 3 areas. One was for upper class people and they paid more money for services. One was for those who could not afford to pay or could only pay a small amount. And the other building was used for research. Demuth will be able to stay in the upper class building because of the support from Albert Barnes. Albert Barnes is also the one that encouraged him to enter the Institute of Psychiatric Treatment. And Demuth was there a couple of times. When Demuth was there, it was again for several weeks. The treatments that Allen provided were early, and because they were early, and insulin was not discovered until 1922, the treatments were often quite harsh. When Demuth was admitted to the hospital, he was put on a fast, and he fasted till he almost passed out. And when Allen was sure that his body had been cleansed of any of the food that had been in it, then he would start to feed him eggs and meat. Eventually, he would have small pieces of vegetables, but they would be weighed carefully because, for example, carrots, they have a lot of sugar in them. So he was very, very particular about his patients, and if you didn't do what he said, then he was not kind. So his was important that Demuth start the injections for insulin for his diabetes. But he was not going to be taken in by just the newest rush of what was out there. And in 1922, he realized that some of the people that were in the Institute had accepted the offer to have insulin injections, and some of them died, and some of them lived, and some of them pretty much recovered, and some of them just kind of stayed the same as they were. And it was because there were, just like with the virus right now, there are a lot of places that are offering opportunities for the virus to be tested. But they're all being, the word there, the operative word is tested. And so therefore, you cannot just become a guinea pig unless you're so sick you don't care. And he wasn't to that point this early in his life yet. And so he waited, and Barnes kept after him and saying, you know, you should try the insulin, you should try the insulin, go to one of the laboratories and have them be the source for you. That has proved to be successful, and the people have lived and maintained a quality of life. And so he does start injections in 1923. He will have injections twice a day for the rest of his life. How does he finance this? Well, Albert Barnes bought paintings. Albert Barnes also provided him loans. One time the bill for the Institute was $500, and Demuth asked him if he could borrow the money, and Albert Barnes sent him a check and said, yes, you can borrow the money, and it's already been paid. There is no interest, no carrying charge, and the bill is clean. And he also provided grants to Dr. Allen to operate the facility. So he did everything he could to help his friend Charles Demuth. He was a wealthy man. Albert Barnes was a biologist. He and another German doctor had discovered some new advances in medicine when he was studying in Europe. He would eventually sell his pharmaceutical company, but he uses that money to live a very, very nice lifestyle. This is the home he and his wife had in Marion. And also to establish the Barnes Foundation, because he was in and out of Paris and London a lot, and he was collecting art, and he brought it home. He loved it. He lived with it. If you've ever been to the Barnes Foundation when it was still in Marion, PA, it was almost dizzying to be in there, because the paintings, there were so many, and they were not in just a logical order. They were hung on the walls wherever they would fit, and it was room after room after room. He and his wife do not have children, and he tragically dies in 1951 in a car crash. He went through an intersection on one of the roads not too far from his home with their they were very fond of one particular dog that they had, and the dog was in the car with him. Albert Barnes died immediately in the car crash, and the dog had to be put down. His wife will continue to live and not pass away until 1966. In their will, they left everything to the Barnes Foundation, and in the process of doing this, they also said, however the paintings are arranged when both of us are gone is how we like them and how we would like you to keep them. And it took a really long time until, through legal quirks and twists, they were able, the Philadelphia Museum of Art was able to take those paintings, establish another building right down Franklin Avenue from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and it is completely filled with the Barnes Foundation collection. The work, the efforts, the time, the expense, and the love of Mr. and Mrs. Barnes. These two pictures can be a little upsetting. This is Charles Demuth as a young man. This is after he has come out of the Physiatric Institute, after he has gone through fasting and a very restricted diet. He will suffer with his diabetes for the rest of his life, but he will still continue to try to travel until 1921. He will go into New York. That's how these two pictures were done by George O'Keeffe's husband, Alfred Stieglitz. But when he is in 1921, he decides he wants to go back to Paris. He just knows that'll make him feel good, and the insulin is working and everything seems to be fine, and he's controlling his diet. He gets as far as London. He sends a letter to Alfred Barnes and said, "I'm in London, old man. I'm doing just fine. I'm here for a week, and then I'm going on to Paris for several more weeks." He's in Paris for 3 weeks, and he's stricken. And he has to be hospitalized in an American hospital in Paris. And he's there for several weeks until they can be sure that it's safe to send him home. When he comes home, he will not leave Lancaster again. Some of that may have been through the encouragement of Augusta, but I think all of it really scared him quite a bit as well. And so from that time forward, he stays in Lancaster. And perhaps some of those times might have been when George O'Keeffe would have come to Lancaster, stayed at the Weber Hotel, eaten at Augusta's table, and enjoyed painting with her friend Charles. I showed you this picture earlier of the courtyard and his room. I went into the house and I went up to this room and I got down on my knees carefully because I didn't want to touch the bed, and I took a shot out of the window at this church because the bed would be here, and it was there, and it would be the scene that Charles would wake up to every morning in his small bedroom / studio. This is what the church actually looks like, and you can tell that's the same. These are 2 paintings that Charles Demuth does of the Holy Trinity Lutheran Church. They are not alike any more than his 2 flower paintings of eggplant or tulips are alike, but these tend to have the precisionist style to them that he uses more frequently with his architectural studies than he does with anything else. I think it's kind of fun to see where some of his lines were established, so I put these on for you, and when I lift them off, you can see something else about precisionism. A precisionist always uses an established line that's already part of the subject to establish the other lines. Someplace in each one of these paintings, there is a line that would extend, and he worked with a ruler, finding those lines and then moving up. Here again, I love trees, and look at this one. Here he has taken a tree, he has broken it with some of the lines, and he has taken some of the branches and they curl around. There's a little bit of his circular shape present in this particular piece. After he develops diabetes, he is now back from Paris and determined to just live and stay there and do the best he can. He starts a series of Lancaster architectural paintings, and these are 2 examples of his work. He's still able to get up on certain days and walk around town and do sketches, but he will work primarily in oil with these paintings. Watercolor is a much quicker, more immediate medium to work in, and with oils, if he didn't feel good for a day or so, he could just stop. And then he could go back to it, and it was exactly as he had left it. I want to try the circles with you again. Look at them. This one is called Welcome to the City. And there are the circular shapes included with the precisionist work. And in the other one, if you notice as you look at it, there's steam escaping from a window. And the steam comes out, and it also has a suggestion of the curved lines. And here he's had fun with the precisionist because each time lines didn't have to go up and come down. They could go any direction at all. And so you have breaks in the surface areas of different objects to get this technique. And if you look carefully, you could see where some of his other impressionist lines, here his precisionist lines are located. This one was done in the provinces. This is a scene from downtown Lancaster. If any of you have sailed on ships that have gone up the Red Sea or into the Nile River, you may be familiar with this scene. The ship that I was on docked at Safaga, so I could go to the Valley of the Kings. And as I stepped out on the deck, as we were approaching the dock, I looked over, and there were all of these huge, big granary storage bins. And it immediately reminded me of this picture. This is one of Charles Demuth's, along with, I saw the figure 5. This is another one of his very famous pieces. These grain mills, the first ones were made out of concrete and steel, as are these two, but they were first made in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, up in that area. And one of the men who worked with grain as a profession learned about it, studied them, and had these two built here in Lancaster County. When you look at this piece, I want you to notice something about it. You see the lines across here? None of them are crossing up here. These go across, but these lines are the important ones. And he calls this painting My Egypt. He starts, after he gets diagnosed with diabetes, that he starts to use unusual names for some of his paintings. And in some cases, you can look at the painting and then look at the title, and without even knowing the date when it was done, you can tell that it probably was done either before, because if it was before, it's pretty much matter of fact. Eggplant and green pepper, for example. But now he's using titles like this. And what does this mean? Howard Carter had discovered King Tut's tomb in 1922. So Egyptian mania is popular all around the world. Another thing, the pharaohs built the pyramids as tombs so that they could live forever. And some people think, and I don't know if they're right or wrong, but this tends to give that feeling of this being Charles Demuth looking at that shape, which is very much like the Egyptian shapes over there, very much reflective of Howard Carter's discoveries, and very much a reflection of where Demuth was with his life, because he knows that his death sentence is probably going to be diabetes. But it's an interesting piece, and again, one of his most popular pieces. Here's another one that he did after he was diagnosed with diabetes. This is 1930. He lives for 5 more years. This is Eshelman's feed mill. John Eshelman, his son, owned the feed elevators, and they are what you saw in the last painting of My Egypt. The office and the plant stood right along the street next to the grain elevators. So when Demuth was sketching this, he only had to turn and he could sketch the grain elevators as well. Notice something curious about the pieces that he did in these last 15 years of his life that are architectural. There aren't people in them. There aren't people in windows. There aren't people on streets. There aren't people in cars. It's strictly the buildings and the architecture that he's working with. This two-story painting, you see the building on the front here? This two-story painting was a new thing. I remember my grandfather on his farm needed to have the barn painted one time, and some men came along and they said they'd paint the whole one side of the barn for nothing at all if they could advertise mill pouch tobacco on it. So of course my grandfather thought that was great and certainly economical. So the back of his barn, away from the house, because my grandfather was particular, the back of the barn had this huge big advertisement all across it for mill pouch tobacco. This kind of advertising, this kind of signage was very popular into the 20s and 30s. This particular painting has an unusual title, and I'm not sure why the title slipped down underneath it, but it did. But the title is A Cousin and Nicolise. A cousin and Nicolise were lovers. She was a slave girl. He was from a wealthy family. The father was not happy about their relationship. So the father put them both in jail. However, somehow or other they escaped, and they finally got married. And this sad tale has a very happy ending. At one point in history, they found out that Nicolette was actually a Saracen princess and of noble ancestry, in fact, more noble than a cousin. So of course the family received her. Here is here's a photograph I found of this scene. Now if you notice this, there's a water tower and it's a smokestack. That's a cousin and Nicolette. Here you can tell that this picture is dated later than 1935. These cars are newer than that, and at some point the water tower is no longer where it was because you have two of these towers here now. But I think sometimes it's fascinating just to see how he took scenery and how he worked with it in interesting ways, and then how people came along and adjusted his paintings because they didn't know he did them. Here's another one. There's the photograph I found, and here are two examples. He calls this one Chimney and Water Tower, which is rather obvious. And then he calls this one Lancaster in the Province #2. This one was done early. He will live 4 years. He dies in 1935 after he has done this one. This one has some of the precisionism in it, but not as much as this one over here. And look what he's done down here to break up the planes. Precisionist artists have a lot of fun. I think I certainly know that I do when I paint that way. I don't know if you're familiar with the poem by Walt Whitman called After All. It's not a long poem, and I don't include it here today, but the gist of the poem is that it looks back in time and it looks at time, and so it looks at the old and it looks at the new, and the very last line of the poem has to do with, after all, maybe the new is not new, and maybe the old is still new. And it's interesting that Demuth would take that poem's title for this painting that he does. This is the final painting that he does in this architectural series, and it was never finished. He really, in the last 18 months of his life, he fought for his life every day, and he was way, way, way too weak to possibly be able to paint. But as you look at this piece, you can see where he started. And I've added some blue lines here, from some of his original areas that he planned to do. And then what I did is when I was finished with that, I took those lines away, and then I saw other lines, other places where lines could be established along a common edge. And so fun for you, I thought, would be to take a look at some of the places where at my painting I might have added the lines for a higher level of precisionism. You have all kinds of angles and things that could have been used. I think if I were to add another one, it would probably go up through here somehow, if I could find a place maybe here to take it up, because this is a very large open area. But wherever the precision lines are, the object that the line passes through can change its color on either side of the line. And you see that here, you see that here, you see that down here. Precision paintings are lots of fun to look at for that reason. This is where he's buried. And I say here that he is laid to rest with his parents, and of course, as you already know, Augusta lives to be 85, so she's certainly not in the family plot at that point in time in 1935, and he is 51 years old. But by the time he died, he had completed 90 works. What happened to his paintings? He gave all of his watercolors, he willed all of his watercolors to one friend of his from New York City, and then he gave all of his oil paintings to Georgia O'Keeffe. She not only became the custodian of all of his paintings, but she also became the one who will become responsible for bringing the name and talent of Demuth to the world, and certainly to the United States. San Francisco Museum of Art, Metropolitan Museum of Art, National Gallery in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia Museum of Art. She carefully selected where all of the paintings would go. In the not too distant past, the gallery, or the Dallas Museum of Art, had a large show of his architectural paintings. And they had them in sequence, clear to the last one he did, called After All. And they had gone around, based on George's notes and their interaction with other museums, they knew exactly where to look to ask or request that the painting be loaned to them for several months so they could do a show. But he has, or we have, Georgia O'Keeffe to thank for all of her efforts. And if you, again, saw my program on her, you know that in 1946, her husband, Alfred Stieglitz, dies. And it will take 3 years to sort through all of his work, and also to assign it or gift it to different museums, different galleries across the United States. There is number 5. I thought you needed one more look at it. Demuth freed American artists to confidently move into modernism. Pop art is to his credit. Abstract expressionism is to his credit. He was a fine artist. He did not try to make a name for himself. He simply tried to paint as best he could. And here you see one of his quotes. Paintings must be looked at and looked at and looked at. No writing, no talking, no singing, no dancing can explain them. And today what I have tried to do is to have you look at his work, to actually see it, to notice that this one has no background behind it, to notice that sometimes the background was selective just to push the object in front forward a little better. Charles Demuth gifted the world with wonderful art. For his short life, he lived well, and he cared a great deal. He had wonderful friends. I never read of anybody who spoke badly of him, and I also think that because of him, we have some of the earlier art movements that started in the United States. Next week, I'm going to be discussing Grant Wood, and I just thought you might be familiar with this piece. It's one of the world's 3 most easily recognized pieces of art, and it's done by a little Midwestern artist named Grant Wood. Grant Wood is the one, as I mentioned earlier, you'll see a picture of a painting he did of his mother holding the snake plant. Just as he added the snake plant to the Georgia O'Keeffe piece when he did a portrait of her. I will discuss this painting and some of the curiosities about it, but I also will go into his life because, as you have learned, and as you're coming to learn, the lives of these artists are just fantastic. And there are so many interesting aspects to them that go beyond just going into a museum and looking at a painting, reading the name, seeing where it came from, and moving on. Stopping and studying is more important. For me to visit a museum takes a lot of work. I have to make sure the museum has a luncheonette or a cafeteria someplace, because after about 2 hours, I am very tired. I love to look at art, but I look at it. And I don't care if I see every piece. And when you go into a gallery, you shouldn't care either. Come back. Just walking by and reading the name and moving on is not even half of the story. So as you are working through my lectures with me, I hope that I am helping you understand some of the artists, see some of their art in new lights, understand it better. And if you have any questions, feel free to be in touch with me. There's my email address. Some of you have been using it. Or get in touch with Willow Valley, because their website is also available for you at askpresenter@willowvalley.org. And I look forward to seeing you next week and talking to you about the wonderful, magical brush of Grant Wood. Thank you very much.